My name is Laura Perry, and I'm a graduate student and instructor at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm going to be talking today about teaching the Anthropocene with graphic novels. This presentation owes a great deal to the undergraduates in my course, Writing with New Media, which I designed and taught last fall. So thanks to those students for informing my thoughts on these texts, and thanks also to you for watching this video, and to the conference organizers for arranging this and for conceiving of a carbon-neutral conference. I look forward to your responses and to the months-long conversation. This presentation considers the potentials of using graphic novels to explore both the ecological and formal questions in the classroom. I'll argue that the aesthetics of temporality, or visual time, in graphic novels encourages readings that take notice of the non-human presence in plots and narrative events. I focus on two exemplary graphic novels that make the invisible visible. The scientific love story, Radioactive, by Lauren Redness, which follows the personal and professional catastrophes of Marie Curie and considers the aftermath of her scientific discoveries. And Richard McGuire's Here, a sequential graphic narrative that depicts one space over time, as it goes from wooded expanse in the 1600s to a suburban house in New Jersey in the 1980s, to completely underwater and back again. In discussing these texts, I will suggest the ways in which these two texts and graphic novels more broadly can help demonstrate and complicate notions of environmental justice, slow violence and contamination, and unruly scales of time and space, both too small and too large to contain. I explore how the conceptual and aesthetic frameworks of the graphic novel genre can generate productive questions about environmental phenomena that are often difficult to conceptualize, stretching beyond human perspective. That the Anthropocene is unruly and difficult to represent with many of our traditional narrative or representational techniques is evident even in the concept itself, in the debate about when it began, whether on July 16, 1945 a.m. in New Mexico, when U.S. scientists tested the world's first atomic bomb, or when Sputnik first made visible global human impacts in satellite images, or any number of other proposed start dates. But more fundamentally than these definitional debates, conceptualizing, and in this case, visualizing the Anthropocene requires considering timescales that go beyond the human and that are not easily categorized nor broken down in cause and effect or a series of events able to be turned into a legible narrative. Rob Nixon's unpacking of slow violence is helpful to consider here. As Nixon puts it, slow violence is a violence that occurs gradually and out of sight, a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space, a nutritional violence that is typically not viewed as violence at all. It is neither spectacular nor instantaneous, but rather incremental, its calamitous repercussions playing out across a range of temporal scales. And this unruly temporality poses, as Nixon argues, formidable representational obstacles. Nixon asks, how can we convert into image and narrative the disasters that are slow-moving and long in the making, the disasters that are anonymous and that star nobody? In many ways, that question has come to be one of the guiding challenges for contemporary authors and artists. And us. Kate Marshall, writing in 2015 about the relationship between climate change and contemporary fiction, persuasively argues that, in fact, the Anthropocene is a temporal horizon of contemporary U.S. fiction. She's speaking in an American context, but I think her ideas and her observations open up beyond that. So Marshall argues that contemporary U.S. fiction seems quite clearly to be responding to the pressures of the larger anthropocenic imagination by staging its own temporality within increasing timescales and geologies. Representing time is a problem for the Anthropocene, just as representing time is also a problem in graphic novels, endemic to the form itself. How to show time on the page, how to create a durational aesthetic. Scott McCloud argues that time and motion in comics is produced between panels in the gutter, in the white space between more representational images, what he calls closure. For example, One image in McGuire's Here shows a series of overlaid images of a man, dressed in overalls, constructing the floor of a house in the early 1900s. Because of the way these images are arranged, readers have to make the conceptual leap that it is not, as it first appears, a group of identically dressed men working in different corners on the same house, but rather the same man depicted over time. In a similar vein, considering the reader's experiences of time as well as the narratological experience of time, Eric Rabkin has also pointed out that visual complexity and information density is often a crucial part of visual time in graphic novels, citing single frames that can hold our eye for minutes as we note and decode a wealth of half-understood detail. McGuire is very attuned to the impact of different levels of visual complexity, moving from images of relative simplicity, where abstraction and cropping remove most of the visual density from the frames, to images of overwhelming visual density, as in one panel where McGuire collects together various insults, jerk, dweeb, and accidents from a broken wine glass to an incoming flood, that have accumulated in this room over time. And in Redness is Radioactive, visual complexity and information density are used both to convey the passing of time and to stop time, to arrest the reader's movement through the narrative. For example, Redness includes a Xeroxed FBI file, in which the layers of bureaucracy, secrecy, and national history are made visible by the smudges and evidence of multiple copies made, the blurred borders, the overlapping and contradicting stamps. It combines to form a clustered but inchoate system of signs that makes the Xerox much more of a purely aesthetic object than a semantically meaningful one. And while both of these notions help to explain some of the ways that time works in Here and Radioactive, they are both more suited to a graphic novel that has a traditional panel structure that follows a traditional temporal structure as well. Neither Here nor Radioactive have consistent panels, however. Radioactive is more like a series of images that accumulate but rarely, if ever, depict motion, more like a collage than a traditional panel-driven comic. And Here, while it does have panels, it's composed entirely of panels, they frustrate closure at every turn. The gutters don't cohere enough, usually, to let us gain that. Here doesn't have fleshed out or stable characters, refusing us narrative as well as visual closure. We might meet someone in one panel and never see them again. We might follow one person through several panels as they tell a joke and start to choke and fall off their chair, but we never learn what happens to them. This is especially foregrounded by the ebook, which enables you to click on smaller panels, attempt to follow narrative threads or conceptual groupings, for example, the path of a small black cat, but in that process denies you any broader narrative coherence. So how to think of how time works in Here and Radioactive? One idea that I found helpful as a way of explaining the lack of closure, the use of different materials to depict time, the jumps between dates that can often be jarring. There's no orderly movement of time in either Here or in Radioactive, where the multiple timelines of the Curies, 1945, various nuclear accidents, and present day often become jumbled or are moved through very quickly in the chapters. So one idea that I found helpful as a way of understanding all of these different ways of depicting time in Here and Radioactive is Victor Bergen's notion of a brecciated time and space, one that Christopher Brew uses well in his essays, considering literature and biopolitics in Insistence of the Material. A brecciated rock is a rock made of other rocks. The word is Italian, meaning loose gravel. So these pieces of loose gravel, each from a different time, come together in one rock. And as Brew points out, within a brecciated conception of time and space, then, dynamics like accumulation by dispossession or biopolitics do not have a single history or a single temporality, but are rather spatially and historically recursive and dynamic, as they are shaped by and intersect with distinct forms of materiality and material practices. In Radioactive, this kind of visual time, of brecciated aesthetics, looks like overlapping knowledges or overlapping epistemologies, as in a chapter where Redness uses multiple forms of representation to attempt to chart the aftermath of Hiroshima on several different scales. She uses Xeroxes, maps, diagrams, paper dolls, photographs, etc., and she's considering in this chapter how personal, political, national, biological, and environmental histories might form a kind of brecciated notion of time and space, where different explanations overlap but nothing coheres. In here, this brecciated form of time and space looks like overlapping temporalities, no single history. And history is very dynamic and unstable, and it's collected together by the graphic novel, but mostly remains loose gravel, nevertheless. In these kinds of depictions, it's not closure nor visual complexity that creates a conceptual and aesthetic sense of time, but rather a layering, a brecciated assemblage that resists any stable notions of time, as the small elements of the whole are all temporally distinct and can often be exchanged for one another. And indeed, in here, it's really jumbled a lot of the time. There's no sense that this is the proper place for this moment in time. It might as well be somewhere else, and often it is, especially in the ebook. You get multiple combinations of the same panels. So, to conclude, having gone through these separate notions of time and thinking about how they might be related to the Anthropocene, I want to take a step back and think about how representing the Anthropocene visually at all might be to participate in it. So one question to consider about both of these graphic novels, particularly given the beauty and usually visually pleasant arrangement of their images, is whether these novels participate in what Nicholas Mirzoff has called aesthetics of the Anthropocene, where visual art, like Monet's 1873 painting, Impression, Sun Rising, which is of the coal smoke over London Harbor. So this painting and other examples that Mirzoff cites at once reveal and aestheticize anthropogenic environmental destruction. So turning back to here and Radioactive and looking at their visuals from this perspective, whether it is in Richard Maguire's Here, the soft, sketched blues of a world underwater, shown from an implicitly non-human or post-human perspective, or in Lauren Redness's Radioactive, with a page depicting an orange radioactive cloud from the first nuclear test, with an atom-like statement of representational power from Marie Curie underneath the image, where she's taking credit for coining the word radioactivity. And this is certainly something that is a lingering question for me in teaching and in writing about the temporal aesthetics of the Anthropocene. How to avoid aestheticizing environmental destruction while also representing it in a compelling way. I think Here and Radioactive both walk this tightrope well of presenting environmental destruction in a compelling and aesthetically compelling way without participating in what Mirzoff might call the aesthetics of the Anthropocene, where you're beautifying environmental destruction. But I look forward to your thoughts on this, and I'm open to other readings of the text. Thank you again for listening.